Nikos Kokkinos holds an archaeological and a PhD in archaeology and Nikos Kokkinos is an archaeologist and historian of the classical periods. He holds a PhD in ancient history from Oxford University, where he became a Dorothy Gray Senior Scholar at St. Huge College. He excavated in Israel, in Jordan, in Syria, and in Turkey, and has conducted museum research in Athens, Rome, Paris, and in London. David Jacobson, who will be speaking in their behalf, from the University of Oxford, holds a PhD from King's College London in classical archaeology and have taught in UCL and in King's College. He served as the executive committee at the Executive Committee of the Palestine Exploration Fund for 23 years and edited the Palestine Exploration Quarterly for 6 years. He currently edits Strata. In 1996, he published with Shimon Gibson a book which was already mentioned a couple of times here today, which is titled Below the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. His latest book is a biography of Agrippa II, published with Routledge in 2019. Today, he will talk about Agrippa, its royal Triclinium, and the Herodian temple.
This evening, I'm going to be talking about Agrippa II's Triclinium and Herod's temple. It's based on research I have done on Agrippa II for my biography. It is this particular study is a joint one with my colleague Nikos Kokkinos, who you've also introduced. I shall continue with the next slide now. Josephus describes a particular incident during the procuratorship of Porcius Festus in the late 50s CE, which attracted my attention because I felt that it throws some light on the position of the inner temple. We have from Josephus an interesting passage about an incident that occurred in Jerusalem during the procuratorship of Porcius Festus from the late 50s CE. About this time, King Agrippa constructed a building of unusual size in his palace at Jerusalem near the Sisters. The palace had been erected long before by the sons of Asmoneus, in other words, Asmoneans, and being situated on a lofty site, afforded a most delightful view to any who chose to survey the city from it. This, by the way, is Nikos Kokkinos' translation. The king was enamored of this view and used to gaze, as he reclined at the meals there, on everything that was done in the temple. The eminent men of Jerusalem, seeing this, were extremely angry, for it was contrary to tradition for proceedings in the temple to be spied on, and particularly the sacred rites. They therefore erected a high wall upon the exedra that was in the inner court of the temple facing west. This, when built, blocked not only the view from the royal dining room, but also that from the western portico of the outer temple, where the Romans used to post their guards at the festivals for the sake of supervising the temple. This passage is from the Antiquities. There are other pieces of information from the Jewish wars, which are shown in the yellow passage below, which tell us that the palace stood above the Sisters on the far side of the upper city. The Sisters was connected with the temple by a bridge. The bridge is the famous viaduct or causeway ending in Wilson's Arch. And we learn further that the palace was close to the northern stretch of the first wall. It must have been on the south side because it was a Hasmonean construction. So if we put everything together, you can see it here. The palace, a presumed location for the Sisters. There's a rock scarp on the western edge of the Tyrrhophian Valley, which bends towards the west. So it couldn't have been any nearer to the northern wall stretch of the first wall then shown. The temple sat obviously on the Temple Mount, The precise location, or at least as precise as we can determine it, I will talk about in the following section of the talk. The second wall, by the way, is still controversial. I've taken this slide from Shimon Gibson's, a book of Shimon Gibson, and I want to thank him for allowing me to use it. So the contention was, what did Agrippa see from the corner of his palace of the inner workings of the temple? So this is what we're going to look at next. Now, for the viewers, I think it does help to have a picture of how the temple stood and how it dominated Herodian Jerusalem. This bird's eye view is taken from a publication on the history and archaeology of Israel, popular one, but it's, I think, very graphical illustration. And you can see the temple enclosure, the temple raised on its platform, the causeway with Wilson's Arch and Robinson's Arch here, and the Tyrophean Valley running across the slide towards the Siloam Pool, and the palace on an eminent position at the northeast corner of the upper city. Now, such temples, the temple in Jerusalem was not unique. In fact, my interest in the subject of Herod's temple goes back many, many years, and it was really the question that I proposed myself was, to what extent was Herod's temple an exceptional construction, an exceptional project? To what extent did it reflect common temple architecture in the late Hellenistic, early Roman imperial period? And I found through working on my PhD in London that actually Herod's temple shared many features of some of the grander complexes, temple complexes in the Eastern Mediterranean. This is the famous Temple of Bel at Palmyra. Unfortunately, it was destroyed almost completely in our own time by the Islamist fanatics in Syria. But what you see in this view, taken obviously some time ago, is the temple sitting on a flat platform which has been artificially raised in certain parts and undercut elsewhere into the topography so that it's totally flat, with a double colonnade running all around it. The sanctuary itself is not strictly classical in its inspiration. It largely is dictated by Semitic sacral practice. It's a tall structure, very tall, and it's got a layout which is specific to the cult of Bel. The outer wall, it has got an upper pilastercourse, as at Jerusalem. So here is a temple, a large complex, a large enclosure, not as large as Jerusalem's temple, which shows a pattern. And if we look at the Temple Mount today, an aerial view, the platform is fairly robust. It's stood the test of time. The perimeter walls have largely survived on three sides and slightly on the northern side. If we look at the sacred area, it's largely preserved by the inner platform of the Dome of the Rock. The southern end goes beyond it, but as I will show you, there is a remnant of its course in the form of an ancient staircase that survived into the 19th century. As far as the palace is concerned, it would have stood roughly here on a high point in the upper city. So again, you see the relative positions. Now, several of us today have spoken about how you reconstruct the inner part of the temple, which is missing. We have the outer enclosure, but the inner precinct is totally missing. And we have the rock, of course, but that requires interpretation. So, in order to carry out a convincing, or at least a credible reconstruction, it's got to be consistent with the textual sources, primarily Josephus and the Mishnah, and maybe some of the Dead Sea material. We are told, for example, that by Josephus and the letter of Aristeas, a pseudepigraphal work, that the temple sanctuary was built on top of the mountain, Mount Moriah. It's got to integrate harmoniously with the surviving walls of the Herodian enclosure and other surviving features, underground systems, whatever remains above ground. Now, this needs to have some sort of correlation with the outer walls is important. All the other classical temples I've looked at do. They relate in their plans. The sanctuaries are cited in a geometrical relationship with the outer walls. And I don't believe Jerusalem was any different. It's got to be entirely consistent with local topography, as Joseph Patrick has pointed out. It's got to share hallmarks with other Herodian building projects, like the tombs of the patriarchs, which has got similar structural features, which I will mention briefly, and if possible, have parallels at contemporaneous temple complexes elsewhere, at Samaria's Sebasti, Caesarea, these pagan temples, but they were Herodian nonetheless, and temples elsewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean. I'm going to refer to two recent reconstructions. There are many of them. As we know, Rittmeyer has discussed them all. This one is by Ehud Netzer, which I think in terms of the inner temple, the inner precinct, comes close to what we now believe to have been the case, that this sanctuary was accompanied by chambers and vestibules in front of each of the entrances. There were three on either side, north and south, and was actually probably a square. The square shape is fairly dominant, in fact, in the temple. The altar was square, the court of the women was square, and I believe the inner court was square. Netzer believes that it was 200 cubits square, and he's probably correct in that regard, although we cannot prove it. Another reconstruction is the one that's been provided by Professor Patrick in the last lecture. But like Professor Netzer's reconstruction, it's tilted towards the southeast with respect to the southern wall. And bears no evident relationship with the outer walls of the enclosure. It also, in my opinion, does not suit the topography that well. But, you know, these are matters I cannot prove. It's purely based on balance of probabilities. He obviously attaches enormous importance to this system here at the south side of the Dome of the Rock. In terms of coming back to the tombs of the patriarchs, the masonry is very similar to that of the Temple Mount. The size and dressing on the stonework is the same. The upper course of wall pilasters is similar to at least much of the peripheral wall of the temple enclosure. And indeed, fragments of wall pilasters survive intact at the northwest corner of the Temple Mount. This is a sketch by Claude Conda, done during his survey of Western Palestine in April 1873, and redrawn in 1877. In resolving the plan, from the outer walls identified several decades ago a pair of equilateral triangles. And what happens in that scheme is that the north-south axis runs along midway between the two large and imposing underground ramped entrances from what was then the old city, the lower city in the Second Temple period, the city of David, and the east-west right through the center of where the Dome of the Rock and the Dome of the Chain now stand, intersecting at the Dome of the Chain. I've modified my views in the light of the recent work done, which has been eloquently encapsulated by Talila Lieberman, which demonstrates that actually the Temple Mount wasn't built in the Temple project was not completed in one stage. It was developed over decades. I don't believe that the northern wall was completed according to the drafted plan, that it actually corresponds with the present northern wall. And in fact, David Gurevich has, in his very excellent talk, has demonstrated this beyond, in my view, the shadow of doubt, that the plan was modified and in fact reduced in area. It also made the northern wall perpendicular to the eastern wall. So I don't believe that this upper equilateral triangle scheme was completed. But if we now look at the tombs of the patriarchs in Hebron, you see that same scheme and a complete one. A pair of equilateral triangles, said the same building techniques, a similar plan. Even the monuments to the matriarchs and patriarchs follow the geometry of that arrangement, which, and by the way, I looked at the plan of the tombs of the patriarchs after I had identified what I believe to be the underlying plan of the Temple Mount. Vitruvius rightly points out to Roman writers and architecture that architects start with an idealized plan and they make compromises. They cut corners for topographical reasons. There's a good topographical reason on the northern wall here that the topography falls away very rapidly, and also in area they wanted to reduce their building. There were probably also earlier structures involved. The Antonia was definitely one of them, and that was angled to the Herodian scheme. Anyway, geometry formed an important element in Herodian decorative arts and architecture. An equilateral triangle is the easiest thing to draw with a pair of compasses. You need nothing else. You can see the layout leading the construction, leading to the equilateral triangles, which takes the form of a rosette with petals at 60-degree angles. Such a rosette pattern, rosette design, has been found indeed within sight of the Temple Mount in a luxury villa in the upper city. This is now being conserved and is now protected. It's inside a modern structure. Also, on countless ossuaries, you see this rosette pattern again, and you can even identify the position of the compass points. You can see the small holes that they left behind in the soft limestone of the sarcophagus, of the ossuaries. Frankie Snyder has pointed out the importance of geometry in Herodian decorative arts in floors, in the opus sectilae floors. This is a scheme that she's reconstructed at Panias, which I agree with her probably belonged to a Herodian palace. Here is a very vivid example of the use of geometry in Herodian building schemes. This is the Doric peristyle court at Machaerus, where you can see a Pythagorean 3-4-5 triangle. You know, if the two sides at right angles are in the ratio 3-4, the diagonal is 5. And this is the famous Pythagorean triangle. And that scheme actually carries over to the spacing of the columns, where you have 3 column diameters apart on the smallest side and 4 column diameters on the longest side. So there was this conscious use of geometrical constructions and calculations. The same 3-4-5 triangle dictated the layout of the Herodian enclosure at Mamre. Mother, the excavator in the 50s, noticed that. As far as the inner temple is concerned, I said that Nikos and I agree that the inner court was probably square. The open area is the one that is defined by the Mishnaic dimensions, 187 by 135 cubits. And Josephus describes the entrances, the 3 to the north and south, and he says that on either side there were exedras. An exedra can be it's a niche, but it can be a room entered by an open colonnade. And the idea of a catenation of alternate modular spaces around the sanctuary we find elsewhere at Gerasa, Jerash. Note also the very
David,
geometrical scheme.
David,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but we've already passed the time. So if you can please,
I'll wrap it
one or
up.
2 more minutes.
I'll wrap it up.
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you very much.
This is the inner temple as we worked out. It's described in detail in our paper, so I won't linger on it. I'll just point out the steps defining the southern end of the enclosure. The use of a secondary courtyard, like the Court of the Women, is found elsewhere in the Greek world. That's a photograph of the steps, Dome of the Rock and Dome of the Chain. Now, I'm coming to the very end of my lecture. Did Agrippa, was Agrippa right in countering the claims against him by the Jewish elders, or were they right? Well, let's have a look. If we place the palace here where I believe it was, and that site still doesn't seem to have been excavated, the view across to the altar could have been over the respective walls, but it would have been largely blocked by the mass of the sanctuary. Building up the western wall, as mentioned by Josephus, would have reduced his visibility, his ability to look into the inner court of the temple. However, if the temple had been skewed towards the southeast, it would be the southern wall that should have been raised, not the western wall of the inner enclosure. So I believe that all those tilted reconstructions are inconsistent with Josephus. This shows a vertical section of our location of the inner temple as viewed from the Hasmonean Palace. You can see that it's possible that he viewed over the wall, but then was blocked largely in viewing the proceedings around the altar by the mass of the sanctuary building. So to conclude, it would have been possible for Agrippa II to have looked over the temenos, all of the temple enclosure from an upper story triclinium in the Hasmonean Palace. His view would have been greatly restricted by the massive structure of the temple sanctuary, and it is unlikely that he would have been able to glimpse the sacrificial rites in the forecourt of the sanctuary. The raising of the western wall of the inner enclosure as a measure to block or diminish Agrippa's eavesdropping on the temple would make no sense if the orientation of that precinct was tilted towards the southeast with respect to the southern temenos wall. But this countermeasure is entirely compatible with the inner enclosure aligned parallel with the southern temenos wall, its main axis passing through the summit of the Temple Mount on which the sanctuary stood. The rock was, I believe, below ground at that time when the temple stood, and the cone, which coincides with the Sakra rock. Well, after the feast, we are left with the scraps. This is the unswept floor mosaic, which is now in the Vatican. Thanks for listening and for your patience.
Thank you very much for our lecturers, for a very interesting session. She'll move straight away for our next one. Professor Katet Citrin, please. Thank you very much.